I thought the hardest part of my marriage was juggling work and family, until the night my wife told me she was unhappy. What came next shattered my world: betrayal, heartbreak, and an affair with the one person I trusted most. But this isn't just a story about losing everything, it's about what you find when you hit rock bottom. Our relationship began like a dream. From the very start, Claire captivated me. Her radiant smile, her vibrant energy, everything about her made my world brighter. We were young and filled with hope, convinced that nothing could ever come between us. I worked long hours, believing I was building a secure future for us, but looking back now, I can see how blind I was to the changes creeping into our lives. Over time, my focus shifted. It wasn't that I stopped caring about Claire, but the shared vision we once had quietly started to unravel. My work became my priority, and without realizing it, we started drifting onto separate paths. Then came the night that everything fell apart. It was late, the rain tapping against the windows, and I was barely awake when her soft voice pierced the darkness. It was almost swallowed by the sound of the storm, but something in her tone stopped me cold. "What did you just say, Claire?" I asked, an uneasy feeling gripping my chest. She switched on the bedside lamp but avoided my gaze. Her eyes looked everywhere but at me, as she whispered, "I'm unhappy, Frank." Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just what she said, it was the way she said it. Her unhappiness wasn't something fleeting or vague. It carried the weight of years of unspoken pain and broken connection. "Unhappy with me?" I asked, my voice trembling as the reality began to sink in. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she turned her face away, unable to meet my stare. "I don't know why, Frank. I just am." Her words left me grasping for answers that weren't there. A flood of emotions surged within me, but frustration quickly rose to the surface. "Do you want to leave me?" I pressed, desperate to make sense of her revelation. She didn't answer, not with words, at least. Her silence cut through me, sharper than anything she could have said. Anger took hold, and I jumped out of bed, pacing as I struggled to process what she'd just revealed. Claire reached out to me, her hand tentative, but I stepped away, unable to accept her touch in that moment. Guilt and confusion clouded my mind. "Do you want to stay married to me or not?" I demanded, my voice louder than I intended. I was grasping for clarity, for something to hold on to, but all she gave me was more silence. Exhaustion overcame me. "I can't do this right now," I muttered, retreating to the small office down the hall to escape the suffocating tension of our bedroom. I thought that was the end of it for the night, but Claire's voice, now raised with raw emotion, reached me before I could close the door. "I want to feel loved, Frank," she shouted, her words echoing through the quiet house. "I want to feel like I matter to someone, like I'm wanted." The truth in her words stung more than I was prepared for. And then, like a crashing wave, she said the name that would shatter everything. "Doug." I froze, the world around me crumbling in an instant. "Doug?" I asked, barely able to form the word. "Doug, my best friend." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. She didn't have to say anything more. My best friend. My wife. Together. The betrayal was too massive for words. It wasn't just that Claire had been unfaithful, it was with him. The one person I thought I could trust outside of her. I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand explanations, but I couldn't. All I could do was sit there, silent, as the weight of their betrayal settled in. I looked at Claire, at her tear-streaked face, and I felt nothing but emptiness. Pain is too small a word to describe what I felt. It's the kind of pain that robs you of breath, that makes you question everything you thought you knew about your life. I wanted to speak, to respond in some way, but what could I say? What could possibly matter anymore? I left the bedroom and retreated to my office, locking the door behind me. I couldn't face Claire, not then, not with everything crashing down around me. Her voice followed, soft but insistent, as she knocked and called my name. I stayed silent, frozen in place, too overwhelmed by the storm of emotions and the haunting images of her with Doug to respond. Eventually, she stopped trying, leaving me alone in the quiet, though solitude was the last thing I felt. The hours dragged by, and sleep never came. My mind wouldn't let me rest, replaying every moment of our relationship, searching for the cracks I had failed to see. Had there been signs? Little shifts in her behavior? But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't pinpoint a single moment where things had begun to unravel. Our relationship had seemed steady, if not particularly passionate. Stable, at the very least. Yet somehow, Doug had found his way into our lives, and into hers, without me ever realizing. I had known Doug for nearly 13 years. We met as co-workers, quickly forming a bond over shared long hours and ambitions. Over time, our friendship deepened, weathering my promotion and his eventual move to a new job. We managed to stay close for years, though looking back now, I wonder if the distance he put between us was intentional, laying the groundwork for something I couldn't have imagined. As night turned into early morning, my thoughts remained tangled in questions about Doug and the betrayal I never saw coming. By the time the first light crept through the curtains, I realized I hadn't slept at all. The day was here whether I was ready or not. I dragged myself to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face, trying to summon the energy to move forward. Part of me wanted to call in sick, to bury myself under the covers and avoid the world. Instead, I lay back down on the couch in my office, staring at the ceiling and listening to the silence of the house. Upstairs, I heard my alarm go off, an unwelcome reminder of the routine I could no longer escape. Before I could muster the strength to turn it off, the beeping stopped. Claire had done it. I stayed motionless, unsure of what to expect. Then came the soft sound of footsteps on the stairs. Moments later, a knock at the office door. "Frank, are you awake?" Her voice was hesitant, cautious. I closed my eyes, pretending to be asleep, silently willing her to leave. Instead, I heard the door open, her quiet steps bringing her closer. "Frank, I know you're awake," she said, her tone more certain now. "We've been together for 10 years. I know how you look when you're sleeping. What do you want, Claire?" I mumbled, not turning to face her. My voice was low, detached, a poor mask for the storm raging inside me. "I was worried about you," she said softly. A bitter laugh escaped me. "You're worried? That's ironic." I kept my back to her, unwilling to let her see the pain in my eyes. "I'm fine. Just go away." She didn't leave. Instead, she started talking, trying to explain, to justify what had happened. "About last night, things got messed up," she began, her voice cracking with fatigue. I couldn't hold back any longer. I turned to face her, noticing the dark circles under her eyes that mirrored my own. "Messed up?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You cheated on me with my best friend, Claire. You want to leave me. That's not complicated, it's pretty clear." She fidgeted, wringing her hands nervously. "It's not that simple, Frank," she whispered. Before I could demand more, the sound of little footsteps interrupted us. Our daughters, Kelly and Stacy, came bounding down the stairs, their bright smiles oblivious to the tension hanging in the air. Claire and I exchanged a glance, silently agreeing to table the conversation for now. No matter what had happened between us, the girls didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of this. We fell into our usual routine, preparing breakfast and getting the kids ready for their day. It was a strange dance, each of us going through the motions while avoiding eye contact and sidestepping the elephant in the room. By the time the girls were off, Claire and I parted ways, our unresolved pain lingering like a shadow over the day. I decided to go to work that morning, even though I was barely holding it together. The thought of staying home and being alone with Claire felt unbearable. The drive was a blur of exhaustion and relentless thoughts, but I forced myself to focus on the road. By the time I arrived at the office, I was determined to push Claire and Doug out of my mind, at least for a few hours. Our company was in the middle of developing a revolutionary new engine, one that promised greater horsepower and fuel efficiency, but the prototype had been failing test after test. My mind quickly latched onto the problem, finding solace in the familiar logic of engineering. At least machines were predictable, unlike the chaos at home. Thomas, my eager intern, was waiting for me as I walked through the door, a cup of coffee in hand and a hopeful expression on his face. "Morning, Mr. Carter," he said, trying to hide his nerves. "I've been working on some ideas to address the cooling system issues. I tried reaching you last night." I cut him off before he could finish. "Not now, Thomas. Let's focus on the engine." I didn't need any reminders of last night, not here. We spent the next hour discussing his theory. While it wasn't groundbreaking, our team had already been exploring similar solutions. I encouraged him to keep refining his ideas. It was easier to throw myself into work than to let my thoughts wander back to Claire. Later, I stopped by Sarah's desk to review the day's schedule. She'd been my assistant for years and had an uncanny ability to read people. She looked up from her computer, her brow furrowed. "You okay, Frank? You seem off today." I appreciated her concern, but I didn't have it in me to explain. "I'm fine, Sarah. Just a rough night," I said, keeping my tone casual. She nodded, though I could tell she wasn't convinced. The day dragged on with the usual meetings and problem-solving sessions. By the time I left the office, the sun had long since disappeared, leaving the city bathed in a cold, quiet darkness. As I climbed into my car, I found a strange comfort in the smooth hum of the engine. It was a reminder of why I loved this field: the precision, the efficiency, the satisfaction of creating something that worked perfectly. Unlike the chaos in my personal life, this felt manageable. Predictable. Have you ever noticed how certain cars, like an Aston Martin or a Tesla, don't even need advertisements? Their presence alone speaks volumes. Just sitting in one feels like a statement, a reflection of power and control. I drove home, letting the engine's quiet strength soothe me. When I stepped inside, the house was a picture of normalcy, at least on the surface. Stacy was sitting at the coffee table, focused on her homework, while Kelly was sprawled on the floor with her coloring book. Claire was on the couch, her laptop balanced on her knees, and the TV was playing an old episode of SpongeBob. "Hi, Daddy," Stacy said, looking up with a bright smile. Kelly barely glanced up, too engrossed in her crayons to notice me. Claire turned her head, her expression cautious. She was trying to read my mood. "Hi, honey," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "How was work?" I shrugged, keeping my tone flat. "It was work." She nodded, a flicker of discomfort crossing her face. I knew she was trying to maintain a sense of normalcy for the girls, but I wasn't ready to pretend that nothing had happened. Not yet. After dinner and the usual bedtime routine with the girls, Claire and I found ourselves alone in the living room. She sat on the couch, scrolling through her laptop, while I pretended to watch TV. The silence between us was suffocating. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "When did it start?" I asked, my voice breaking the fragile calm. Claire looked up, startled. "What?" "The affair," I clarified, my tone sharper now. "When did it start, Claire?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the laptop. "Around April," she admitted quietly. "April," I repeated, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. "That's months of lying, Claire. Months of betrayal. Was it worth it?" Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice grew firm. "You think this is just about one affair, Frank? What about all the anniversaries you missed? The vacations, the date nights you canceled for work? You were here, but not really here. Don't turn this around on me," I shot back, standing now. This isn't about my job or a missed birthday. You made the choice to cheat. Her voice hardened. And I wasn't even planning to, but Doug listened, Frank. He listened to me cry about how invisible I felt. You were so busy with your engines and projects, I didn't exist anymore. Her words stung, but they didn't excuse what she'd done. Exhausted and emotionally drained, I went to bed alone that night, knowing that the road ahead would only get harder. The next day, I began looking for a lawyer. Sarah referred me to Terrence Ross, a lawyer from our company, who promised to connect me with someone experienced in divorce cases. It was clear, I needed help to navigate the storm Claire had brought into my life. When I met Terrence, or Terry, as he insisted I call him, in his office, he welcomed me with a warm handshake and the kind of knowing look only someone who's been through the ringer could give. After a bit of small talk, he got straight to the point. So, what's the situation? He asked gently. I took a deep breath. My wife's filing for divorce. She cheated on me, I said, the words tasting bitter as they left my mouth. Terry nodded, his expression sympathetic. I've been there, he admitted. Went through a messy divorce myself. It's a hell of a thing. His honesty caught me off guard, but it felt good to talk to someone who understood. We spent the next hour discussing my options and the steps I'd need to take. He offered sound advice, but when the meeting ended, the weight of it all settled back onto my shoulders. Back at home, the tension was suffocating. Claire and I had reached a fragile truce for the girl's sake, but every interaction was laced with unspoken pain. I kept to my office most nights, sleeping on the couch and avoiding Claire as much as possible. One evening, I overheard her on the phone. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but her soft laughter drifted through the house, stopping me in my tracks. Then, clear as day, I heard her say, "Yes, Doug. Yes." In that moment, my heart shattered all over again. Any lingering hope I'd been clinging to was obliterated. The bond we once shared was gone, and I knew, truly knew, that our marriage was over. Tears burned in my eyes as I left the room without a word, ignoring Claire as she called after me. I locked myself in my office and broke down, crying harder than I ever had before. Claire came to the door, knocking softly, her voice full of apologies. But I couldn't face her. Just go away, I said, slamming the door shut when she tried to come in. Rage simmered beneath my grief, and before I could stop myself, I grabbed my car keys and drove to Doug's place. When he answered the door, his expression was a mix of surprise and guilt. I wanted to punch him, to demand answers and make him feel the pain he'd caused, but I forced myself to stay calm. You've got a lot of nerve, I said through clenched teeth. After everything you've done, you dare to act like you're sorry. Doug looked down, shame flickering across his face. I am sorry, Frank. It's been eating at me. Eating at you? I shot back. What exactly are you sorry for, Doug? For stabbing me in the back? For destroying my marriage? For breaking up my family? We had 13 years of friendship, 13 years, and you threw it all away. Doug struggled to meet my gaze. I messed up. I don't know what else to say. His apology felt hollow, but I didn't press further. Violence wouldn't fix anything, and answers wouldn't undo the damage. Instead, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the doorway. As the divorce process gained momentum, Claire and I continued living under the same roof, though my office had become my permanent sleeping quarters. The pain and anger dulled over time, but it never disappeared entirely. There were still moments that reignited the hurt, hearing her giggle on the phone or spotting a gift that I hadn't given her. Each time, it felt like a fresh wound, but I learned to let those moments pass. The truth, though, was harder to face. I began to realize how much I had hidden behind my work, using it as an escape from the responsibilities of being a husband and father. I had always justified my long hours as providing for my family, but deep down, I knew I had chosen work because it was easier than confronting the struggles at home. One night, I closed my laptop and made a decision. "Girls," I called out. "Who wants pizza and ice cream?" Their joyful screams filled the house as they rushed to my side. Kelly threw her arms around me. "You're the best daddy ever," she giggled before she and Stacy fell asleep on the couch, their faces lit with smiles. In that moment, I realized that while my marriage was over, my role as a father wasn't. I couldn't undo the past, but I could be present for my daughters. They deserved that much, and more. The drive home was silent, the weight of Claire's words heavy on my mind. Kids rarely see their parents' flaws when they're young, even when those flaws cut deep. I wondered how my daughters would remember us, how they'd make sense of this fractured version of their family. When we pulled into the driveway, I texted Claire, "Girls are asleep. Need help." A moment later, she came out, her face unreadable. Together, we carried the girls upstairs, tucking them into bed. It was one of those small acts of parenting that felt so ordinary yet bittersweet. Once the doors were closed, Claire and I found ourselves face to face in the hallway. "So, you finally stopped working long enough to spend time with them," she said, her tone teetering between surprise and sarcasm. "I bet they loved that." "What did you do?" "Pizza and ice cream," I replied flatly. "Apparently, they enjoy being around me." "Is that what you wanted to hear?" Claire crossed her arms. "That's not what I meant. I just needed to know." I couldn't stop the bitterness from creeping into my voice. "Well, soon you'll have all the time in the world to spend with Doug. You two can ride off into the sunset." "Don't do this, Frank," she said, her voice strained. "What's done is done. Talking like this will only make it worse." I laughed, cold and hollow. The irony. "You set us on this road, Claire. Now you want to avoid the pain." Her expression hardened. "In case you forgot, you neglected me first. And I'm so tired of hearing that excuse." I snapped. "You cheated on me with my best friend. Whatever flaws I have, that doesn't justify what you did." The argument died in the silence that followed. I could see in her eyes that she was wrestling with the same guilt I was, though maybe for different reasons. We were two people desperately trying to explain away our choices, but the truth was, there was no justification. I'd spent years hiding behind excuses, pretending that my workaholic tendencies were for my family's benefit. But deep down, I knew I had chosen work because it was easier than facing the mess I'd helped create at home. Claire likely had her reasons too, though I couldn't bring myself to care anymore. My father used to say, "Tomorrow's man is made by today's choices." When I was younger, those words didn't mean much. Now, they guided me like a harsh but necessary truth. The man I was today, a work-obsessed husband, a distant father, was the result of my own decisions. If I didn't like that man, I had to start making different choices. That night, I was confronted with one of those choices in a place I never expected. Out of desperation and loneliness, I went to a bar, hoping to drown my pain in something, or someone, who didn't remind me of Claire. That's when I met her, a woman whose confidence was magnetic and whose touch was a fleeting escape. She took my hand, leading me to a quiet corner, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a connection, not love, but something close to comfort. In a private room, she asked me what I wanted. The truth spilled out before I could stop myself. "I don't know," I admitted. She straddled me, whispering in my ear, offering more than just her company. When she asked if I wanted more than a lap dance, I nodded, barely aware of my own response. She smiled knowingly and made her terms clear: a room, a ride after work, and $300. In that moment, I faced a choice. The promise of temporary relief was tempting, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't fix anything. I followed through anyway, booking a room by the beach with a balcony overlooking the waves. But when it came time to leave, I hesitated. She saw right through me, recognizing that I wasn't looking for a fleeting distraction, I was searching for something far more complicated. "You want a girlfriend experience," she said softly, her tone filled with understanding. "But that's not what I can give you." When she mentioned my wife, the tears I'd been holding back finally broke free. I cried harder than I had in years, and to my surprise, she didn't pull away. Instead, she stayed, her hand resting gently on my shoulder. When the sobs subsided, she apologized, not for anything she'd done, but for the fact that she couldn't be what I needed. "This isn't about love or connection," she said firmly. "I can give you one night, but I can't give you more." I nodded, understanding but no less broken. That night wasn't the escape I had hoped for, but it was a stark reminder of the emptiness I was trying, and failing, to fill. I didn't push her for more when she told me she needed to get home. Despite how little I knew about her, I felt an odd sense of comfort around her, like we understood each other on a level deeper than our superficial interaction. "It's a long, boring story," she said with a warm smile when I tried to ask about her past. "Trust me, you don't want to hear it." I couldn't help but grin. "You say that, but you're the one who got me to talk all night. You might owe me a little backstory." Her smile widened. "You paid me $300 and bought me breakfast. Pretty sure anything beyond that is a bonus, so think of this as getting your money's worth." We both laughed, and the tension between us lightened. Before I knew it, I was spilling everything, starting from the night Claire admitted she was unhappy, to my discovery of her affair with Doug, and even the moment I walked into this very bar feeling broken. She listened without judgment, nodding thoughtfully as I unraveled the chaos of my life. When I asked her why she did this work, her expression shifted. For a brief moment, I saw a flicker of pain behind her eyes. "It's complicated," she said, her voice quieter now. "Let's just say life doesn't always go the way you plan." Clearly, she'd been hurt before, and part of me wanted to press further, to understand her story. But before I could, she glanced at the clock. "Frank, it's late. I need to get home and sleep." 5 a.m. is way past my bedtime," she said, redirecting the conversation. I checked my watch in disbelief. "It's already 5. Wow. Time flies when you're with me," she teased. "I have that effect." "Frustrating is more like it," I quipped. "We've spent all night talking about me, and I still don't know anything about you." She laughed but didn't offer more, leaving me to wonder about the life she kept carefully hidden. After a few nights away in a hotel, I returned home feeling different, like I'd turned a corner. The clarity I'd found helped me face the situation more calmly, but it didn't make living with Claire any easier. The morning after I got back, she knocked on my office door. Her voice was tentative, almost nervous. "Frank, can we talk?" she asked. I opened the door, amused by her sudden concern about my whereabouts. "Don't worry," I said flatly. Nothing happened. I didn't really care what she thought anymore, but it seemed easier to reassure her than to let her press for details. She nodded, but her expression betrayed something deeper, like she didn't believe me or wasn't sure she wanted to. Over the next few weeks, I started preparing to leave the house. I rented a storage unit and began moving some of my belongings there, sorting through years of memories with a mix of relief and sorrow. I also started looking for a new place, leaning toward a small condo near work. Claire and I managed to keep things civil for the sake of the girls, but any conversation between us was laced with tension. One day, after another strained exchange, I couldn't hold back. "You don't care that you destroyed our family," I snapped. "Maybe your boyfriend does." She looked shocked, her voice trembling. "Do you have to be like this now, Frank? Of all times? Can't you just be human? I'm hurting too, you know." Her words only fueled my anger. "Who cares if you're hurting?" I shot back. "You made this mess, and now we're all suffering because of it. Go to Doug. Spread your legs for him, he was so helpful when you needed someone to move on from me." Maybe he can help you forget the pain you've caused our daughters. The venom in my voice stunned even me, and I saw her flinch. For a brief moment, I felt regret, but it was fleeting. Claire had made her choices, and I wasn't ready to soften. Later that day, I received an unexpected email from my company, requesting a meeting. The message mentioned Doug and hinted at legal issues involving him. When I arrived, my assistant Sarah greeted me with a curious look. "I heard he stole company secrets when he left," she whispered, lowering her voice. "They might be planning to sue him or something." Hearing that Doug was in trouble was a small, dark victory. Still, I couldn't believe he'd be foolish enough to do something that reckless. Why involve me? When I walked into the meeting, a schematic was laid out on the table, one I recognized immediately. It was the propulsion system design Doug and I had taken from another intern, Donald, years ago. This looks familiar," I said cautiously. "Why are you asking me about it?" The room fell silent, and my stomach churned as I realized just how deep this mess might go. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, feeling the weight of my past mistakes pressing down on me as the meeting continued. One of the department heads leaned forward, tapping the table for emphasis. "We believe Mr. Stampert developed this design while employed here, using company resources. He recently patented it, and his company plans to launch it soon. If we can prove he created it here, we can claim it as our intellectual property." I felt my stomach drop. Wait. Doug patented this? The heads exchanged glances before one responded, "Yes. And we'll need your cooperation, Frank. Would you be willing to testify against him?" The question hung in the air, laced with irony. One of the executives smirked, adding, "You'd have to be okay with testifying against a former friend." Terry, seated beside me, raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. I hesitated, then forced a small smile. "If it's for the good of the company, I'm in," I replied evenly, masking my unease. Inside, though, my thoughts were racing. The idea of Doug squirming under legal pressure was oddly satisfying, but the implications of my involvement in that old design theft loomed large. As the team began discussing next steps, another executive chimed in. "We need to track down Donald. If he has any proof, like an email or a draft saved on his work account, that could seal the case. I'd suggest checking his company email," I added. "He might have sent the design to himself back then." They nodded, clearly excited by the potential of reclaiming the patent. Meanwhile, my mind was spinning. If they uncovered the full truth, my own role in the design's history might come to light. That night, as I sat in my office at home, my phone rang. The caller ID flashed Doug's name. I answered reluctantly, bracing for whatever excuse he'd conjure up. "Frank, please," he began, his voice panicked. "You have to help me. This is my livelihood. If they revoke the patent, I'm done. Don't let my mistakes ruin my life. You're better than that." His groveling was almost laughable. I decided to play along. "Okay, Doug," I said slowly, "I'll help you. But you have to stop seeing Claire. That's the deal." There was a long pause on the line. "You win," he said finally, his voice heavy with defeat. "I'll stop." I couldn't help but smile bitterly as I replied, "You really thought I'd help you? Have a nice life, Doug." And with that, I hung up, savoring the satisfaction of slamming the door on him for good. Weeks passed, and life settled into a rhythm. Work kept me busy, and my daughters filled the quiet moments at home with their laughter. My interactions with Claire remained civil, and though the pain lingered, it began to dull with time. One evening, as we cleaned up after dinner, she surprised me by saying, "I've been thinking a lot about everything, what I did to us." I looked at her, wary but curious. "And I should have come to you, Frank," she admitted. Before Doug. I should have asked for counseling or something. I owed it to you, to us, and especially to the kids." Her voice cracked, and she wiped her eyes. I regret everything. You didn't deserve it. Her sincerity caught me off guard. I appreciate that, Claire. It means more than you know. One evening, as I walked to my car after work, I heard footsteps behind me. Before I could turn, I was tackled to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I looked up to see Doug on top of me, his face twisted with rage. You ruined my life, he shouted, throwing wild punches. His fists barely landed, but his anger was palpable. I managed to push him off and scramble to my feet. Doug, you did this to yourself. I shouted back, keeping my distance as he stumbled forward, breathing heavily. You stole from the company, you betrayed me, and now you're paying for it. Donald is suing me, he spat, his voice hoarse. They're coming after everything. I didn't reply. Watching him like this, consumed by the fallout of his choices, I felt no sympathy, only a sense of closure. Doug had made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. Not long after, I moved into a small condo closer to work. It wasn't as grand as the house I'd left behind, but it was mine. The girls loved visiting, and we'd fill our weekends with laughter and pizza nights. Slowly, I began to rebuild, not just my life, but myself. For the first time in years, I felt like I was starting to come home to who I really was. I shared the details of my new place with Claire when she asked about it. It wasn't much compared to the home we had built together, but it was perfect for me. The backyard was modest but cozy, with just enough space for the girls to play when they visited. A park was a short walk away, and a bike trail led straight to the beach. It felt like a place where I could start over, a fresh canvas for a life I was still figuring out. Moving day was bittersweet. Excitement about a fresh start mingled with a lingering nervousness about what the future might hold. Luckily, Terry showed up to help. Despite his own past mistakes, he'd become a steady presence in my life, a reminder that even the worst mistakes didn't define a person forever. As we loaded the last few boxes into the truck, he wiped his hands on his jeans and asked, "Want to grab a bite at Mari's later?" The mention of Mari's made me think of Sandra. I hadn't seen her since that night at IHOP, though she often crossed my mind. I remembered her as more than the confident woman I'd met at the club. It was the Sandra I'd seen that night over pancakes, the one who comforted me when I was at my lowest, that stayed with me. She was a complex, caring person, someone who hid behind a tough exterior but had so much depth underneath. "Nah, let's hit a sports bar instead," I replied, brushing off the thought. The truth was, I couldn't face seeing Sandra again in her starlit persona. Whatever connection we'd had felt real, but it hadn't been forged in the dim lights of her workplace. It was during that quiet, late-night conversation that I'd seen the real Sandra, and I wasn't ready to blur those lines. Weeks later, fate stepped in. I was leaving a coffee shop when I spotted Sandra in the parking lot, heading toward her car. She looked different, casual, more relaxed, like she wasn't hiding behind any masks. My heart raced as I called out to her. "Sandra! Wait!" She turned, her expression a mix of surprise and wariness. "Frank?" I walked up, nerves making my steps heavier. "I didn't think I'd see you again." She raised an eyebrow, her guard clearly up. "Well, here I am. What do you want?" "I don't know," I admitted, fumbling for the right words. I've been thinking about you. About that night." She sighed, crossing her arms. "Frank, I've been down this road before. People like me don't fit into your life. What are you going to tell your parents? Your kids? How we met?" Her voice softened, but her eyes stayed sharp. "It doesn't end well for me." She turned toward her car, but before she could get in, I stepped in front of it, planting myself firmly in her path. "Get out of the way, Frank," she shouted, exasperation clear in her voice. "No," I said, standing my ground. "Not until you hear me out." Her hands gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, but after a moment, she got out of the car. Fine. Say what you need to say. I took a deep breath. I don't have all the answers, Sandra. I don't know how this would work, or if it even could. But I feel something for you. And I think you feel it too. She looked away, her arms crossed defensively. And what exactly do you want, Frank? A relationship? A fairy tale? I shook my head. We don't have to date. We don't have to put a label on it. I want to get to know you. The real you. Can we at least be friends? She was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on a point in the distance. Then, she let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. You're stubborn, you know that. I've been told, I replied, smiling. Sandra sighed again, but her posture softened. All right, Frank. We'll see where this goes. No promises. That's all I'm asking for, I said, relief washing over me. As she got back into her car, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope. It wasn't much, just a faint flicker. But sometimes, even the smallest light is enough to guide you through the darkness.